speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Mr. Doug Christie. And certainly he needs very little introduction. We all are familiar with our now famous battling barrister. However, I do believe that congratulations are in order on his victory in the Emery Finta case. It's my pleasure now to call on Mr. Doug Christie.
Well, I see that on the agenda to the persons in attendance, I'm going to be speaking about the issue of what price freedom. Obviously, this could be approached with all the old cliches, and we could lament the circumstances in which we live. We could also lament the fact that many people don't support those who are under attack enough to save those of us who will later be under attack. But the fact of the matter is we have to have a plan to solve the problem. I'm going to just analyze in a few words the circumstances of a number of people who in this country are being persecuted for their opinions, for their beliefs, and I'm going to offer a solution by way of the democratic process, information and involvement. I guess you have to understand the problem to begin with. The problem can be demonstrated best by the people who are being victimized by it. First person I'd like to mention is Malcolm Ross, who's here today. Now, Malcolm Ross is slightly different than the position of James Keegstra, who was here. There he is, and he's here today. Malcolm Ross is currently going through the New Brunswick Court of Appeal. And of course, I don't expect that there'll be any improvement in the circumstances there. We've already seen from the fact that the court wrote a letter saying they'd allow us a 50-page factum if we got consent of the other lawyers. We got the consent of the other lawyers, and they denied the 35-page factum. That resulted in the appeal being put off until the fall. But basically, the difference between the position of James Keegstra, who expressed views in class that raised issues I guess the authorities don't want raised, and put forward ideas that the authorities don't want put forward, and the situation of Malcolm Ross is that his activity was to write books that expressed his Christian beliefs, as did James Keegstra, in the class, but out of the class. So there's a progression here from James Keegstra, who expressed his Christian faith in the class, to Malcolm Ross, who expressed his Christian faith out of the class, and the difference in result is non-existent. There is no difference. The only difference is in the procedure used to destroy them. The procedure in James Keegstra's case is the criminal process. In the case of Malcolm Ross, it's the, quote, human rights process. Then, of course, there's, earlier than that, the case of Ernst Sundal. These major cases involve fundamental issues of freedom of expression, but that issue has never been allowed to be expressed to the jury in any of those three cases. Public opinion, of course, is largely contrived and created out of media impressions that have very little to do with reality. But the case of Ernst Sundal is now in the Supreme Court of Canada, and there is some possibility that that will result in a destruction of the law that is so oppressive against freedom of speech, the law that says it's an offense to publish, quote, false news. Well, those three cases affect their families. They affect a lot of other people in the community, and they're impact prosecutions. They're designed to terrorize the public at large, and they are, in effect, successful. I want to analyze the problem to begin with because I want us to look at it as it really is, and then to find what we have to do about it. I think the most tragic situation that exists today is the case of Terry Long. Now, Terry Long, right or wrong, for whatever his reasons, was expressing his genuinely held, perhaps religious and no doubt political views by conducting himself on private property at a private meeting. Whether or not he conducted himself properly or improperly is irrelevant, really. He's been separated from his family. I think one of the greatest things about James Keekstra and Malcolm Ross is that they have the support of wonderful families and a number of good friends in the community. But of course right now nobody knows where Terry Long is. He's on the run from what? A human rights tribunal. And his family, his wife, is suffering enormously for basically believing what her family chooses to believe. Now this, in a society that advocates tolerance and expresses the belief that it is tolerant. The next case, of course, that comes to my mind at least is that of an individual called Derek Peterson and the Liberty Net. Now what their great crime is to publish and to record their political views about such things as the kosher certification on food and music and culture and other things of this kind on their own answering machine, to which one would only get access if they dialed the number and pressed numbers on their phone to elicit the answer from a computer. So just dialing the number doesn't get the recorded message. This too is not regarded as freedom of speech in this country. It's prohibited already by the federal court, and perhaps probably soon by a hand-picked human rights tribunal. Well, these are the facts. These are things we have to cope with. These are realities. Of course, we all know that John Ross Taylor went to jail for a long period of time for having a tape-recorded message on his telephone answering machine and refusing, in effect, to change his political opinions. Whatever those opinions may be, or may have been, they were not accused of being false, or dishonestly held, or even untruthful as to fact. But he went to jail at an advanced age, which I'm told is not 87, and is not even 80 yet, but very close to 80. He went to jail for a considerable period of time once, and then went to jail again when he tape-recorded different messages. Nobody seems to care. Certainly in the judiciary, there didn't seem to be any consideration for the real issue in that case. The cases of Harkis and Scriba are about to go to trial in June in Winnipeg. The charge of promoting hatred again is one charge, which will start June 22nd. September will be the commencement of a preliminary hearing for a new charge that's never been tried in Canada before, advocating genocide, which results from two people talking to each other on the telephone about an American movie, among other things. The American movie, which was called Betrayed, was supposed to involve something called a hunt of some kind. And their joking remarks about this movie is part of the Crown's case of advocating genocide, because they appeared to laugh and joke about what the movie portrayed as being serious. So laughing about a Hollywood movie has been part of the Crown's evidence. Of course, thousands of hours of phone calls between these two individuals have been taped. No public statements are necessary for the crime of advocating genocide, it appears. Private conversations qualify. And that should be considered by anyone who has a private conversation, perhaps even involving a racial joke. You know, there are many people who believe so much in politically correct thinking that they think that's all right, that prosecution of persons for racial jokes should be justified. In any event, Harkis and Scriba will go to trial in the fall. Paul Fromm is accused also of making a joke. That's what brought about an enormous amount of public attention to him when someone by the name of Bobby Wash was making some comments about how terrible whites are. And I think the comment was made, and you never hear this correctly in the media, but I think Fromm said, what should we do with them? Scalp them, or something to that effect, in the back of a meeting. And from that moment on, his life has been, as Mr. Leuchter's was, hell. They're also, of course, referring to some speech he made I guess we all have to watch now where we speak, who we speak to, what we say, because of the implications on our careers. And this becomes like basically a police state. I don't think the police are too thrilled with the idea of having to enforce these laws, but they will. And they'll carry out orders. And then they will plead, if ever there's a need, that they were only following orders. We all know what that accomplished at Nuremberg. But Paul Fromm, of course, is the next target of the adversaries of freedom. And these people have no reasonable limits to their persecution of freedom of speech. They move from someone speaking in a classroom where they vilify that person by saying, oh, imagine the impact on these poor captive students, to someone who's writing a book to the world at large and nobody has to read it, so they can't use that argument anymore. Then they move to someone who has never said anything in class or published anything but made a comment in a public meeting. Then they move to someone who has a private telephone machine. Where will they stop, ladies and gentlemen? They won't stop until they have invaded the mind, the private conversations, the very soul and heart of every citizen, and eradicated what they consider to be politically incorrect. And that is tyranny. This is the tyranny of the new Puritans, the new thought police of 1992. The Heritage Front in Toronto had also some tape-recorded messages which they had to carefully craft to avoid any implications that might offend minority groups, and they are now before the Human Rights Commission. And in the back of the room, I don't think anyone should ignore or be unaware of the consequences to Judd Killorn and the public, who is the author of the book Stop Apologizing. The very title becomes provocative because I guess they want us to keep apologizing. And the fact that he wrote the book and sent it to members of Parliament resulted in an enormous storm. And I'm only saying this in jest, but it makes you almost suspicious of him that he hasn't been the victim of some prosecution already, and maybe he will. But I recall him saying very courageously, I think, and telling me that he said, go ahead, basically make my day and charge me. And that's the kind of courage that I guess the authorities find just a little intimidating themselves. And I'd say that you know, I want to basically analyze where we are in terms of freedom of speech, and then I want to put forward some solutions, because this is not a happy hour. You know, this is not a happy time. This is not a situation where we have any real cause, in terms of what the world might say, to rejoice. Because consider even the implications of this conference itself. Here is a peaceful, lawful assembly, privately held, to which the public is not invited, to which no one need take offense because we're not advertising our presence. This meeting was effectively banned by those who, in effect, would and did practice terrorism, threaten to bomb hotels where this meeting would be held, to privately discuss the issue of freedom of speech with people who have been persecuted for their speech. Now, how far can people be driven in a free and democratic society away from and from their rights? It's outrageous that we, in effect, have had to hold this conference secretly for fear of our lives, practically, and certainly to avoid the implications of having it cancelled. The very implication of that is that freedom doesn't really exist in this country any longer. We're informed that the police at the present time are aware of the existence of this meeting, and they're talking about it over the radio as a football game. And they said that there's no trouble at the football game today, it's 5-0. Well, what they meant was there were 5 people assembled outside, and there wasn't any likelihood there'd be any more, I guess. You know, it's really quite outrageous that we're confronted with a situation where everyone is basically driven onto the defensive about standing up for freedom of speech. Now, that should make us angry. The great tragedy is that it doesn't make the general public angry. It doesn't seem to bother anybody at large because they themselves don't feel the pinch. The minute, you see, but they're not concerned about principle, they're concerned about themselves personally. As long as they personally are not worried about seeing hockey night in Canada or the next football game, they're not going to be too concerned. Another great tragedy is to hear from Fred Leuchter that, and it's true, he needs money. Now everybody who's being attacked for their opinions and beliefs is driven by the lack of money onto the defensive, into retreat, and into destruction, and often into despair. That is a common denominator, it seems, for everyone who is faced with this persecution because the state has all the money from all the taxpayers of the entire country. That's a real problem. Now let's confront the problems as they are. Let's understand them, let's confront them, and let's realize what those problems are in the interests of truth, freedom, and justice. There's another individual many of you may not know, and his name is Mark Kreutzer. His great crime was to stand outside a school and distribute literature that questioned some aspects of the Holocaust. He was approached, he was pushed and pushed again and again by a larger man who was from the school of vice principal. He eventually pushed back, he was pushed further, and he eventually hit back. He was charged with assault, and by virtue of a very strange series of circumstances, he was eventually convicted, and that matter's under appeal. But you can see what this does. In front of a whole bunch of other students, it demoralizes, humiliates, terrifies the students into thinking you must all think alike. And you must accept the party line and do what you are told in terms of belief. And it produces basically mindless idiots who drop out with basically disgust, because that everyone knows the truth about the system itself. And it's produced troubles for his family. He was recently expelled from a political party. Now, you know, for a conviction for common assault, one would think that there are many people in political parties who have criminal convictions, not normally resulting in expulsion, but he was written a letter specifically by the leading lights of a political party called the Reform Party, and advised that his membership would be cancelled, and that's being grieved or arbitrated. Well, I suppose we have to approach all these problems, first of all, with a healthy suspicion, but something short of total paranoia. Because a total paranoia produces basically defeat, despair, apathy, and it produces paralysis. You know, people who are totally paranoid are totally paralyzed. They do nothing. And of course, we could all do nothing. That's not why you're here. That's not why I'm here. We have to have a combination, I suppose, a balance between healthy suspicion and skepticism, and a balance between that and total paranoia. Well, faced with these realities, what do we do? It's going to become more and more difficult to communicate any controversial ideas in society. As the traps and the tightening of the stranglehold becomes greater, we have to do what always we have done, of course, continue to speak out, continue to stand up and all that. That's sort of a given. But every wheel needs a hub. Every wheel needs a hub. And what in effect has brought everyone into this room, I believe, is a common concern for the destruction of things they believe in, and a common concern that freedom of speech must survive, must prevail, because without freedom you cannot have truth, without truth you cannot have justice, without justice you cannot have peace. So those are all interrelated. So I raised this question after analyzing very briefly these problems. How can people survive with their freedom, with their principles and beliefs, whatever they may be? Well, they have to have a society that is supportive of their beliefs and in which they are secure in their beliefs. They must be able to educate their children. They must be able to endure in their old age, surrounded by persons who will care for them. They must be free to make a living. And as you find with Fred Leuchter, of course, his living had depended upon government, and it is now totally cut off. So a lesson to be learned from that is that there is no security by being dependent upon government. And analyzing what solution there is, we have to look at current political reality, because these are political problems. They're not legal problems. We have these enshrined rights like freedom of opinion, freedom of thought, belief, expression, and then we have these limits in which the government can legislate away those freedoms if it is, quote, demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society. And what does that boil down to? That boils down to what the judges decide, who are politically, basically appointed. And that definition can be made for better or for worse. You see? And it depends on the kind of judges we have. There is discretion in our laws to make it free or to make it unfree. And so it becomes, in effect, a political problem. The legal principles are sufficiently vague that it becomes a political problem. It's a matter of public opinion. Now, you and I feel somewhat more secure here today than we would feel isolated individually in various parts of the world. There are people here from the Maritimes, there are people here from Ontario, there are people here from all over Western Canada. And what brings us together is concern, I think, for freedom of expression and belief, and also to share solutions that we can accomplish in the preservation of those freedoms. The political situation in major cities around North America is going to deteriorate. There will be more events, much like what happened in Los Angeles. And there doesn't seem to be any such thing as fairness anymore in the legal system. There doesn't seem to be a means to preserve, for example, private meetings, such as happened in Salmon Arm, against virtually violent demonstrations. Assaults occur against people who hold these beliefs, and nothing happens. They can be witnessed by the police, and nothing happens. People can be held captive by so-called demonstrators, who are basically a mob, and nothing happens. So that the rights other people have will not be held by those who hold these unpopular views about history. So we live in an age that's hostile to truth, and although tolerance is universally decried and maintained as a theory by liberals and socialists, they have no tolerance of any views that they don't agree with. I think Mr. Justice Sapinka said it best when he spoke to the Empire Club in Toronto, that even judges are being pressured to basically conform to politically correct views. And the idea that some groups who have in the past been oppressed are now demanding that their critics not only be criticized, but they be suppressed, is the inversion of all freedom for which legitimate people ought to live. So the opponents of freedom basically are eliminating any rights for any, quote, right-wing or Christian values or impressions. Faced with such venomous attacks as I've seen upon Malcolm Ross and James Keegstra and John Ross Taylor and Ernst Zundel and even Imre Finta, it seems clear that the system has adopted a political solution wrapped in a legal robe for its desire to silence its enemies. I've seen judges simply misrepresent the facts. I've been criticized myself for reading from the Bible to the jury, who swore on the Bible. Very severely criticized. Very severely criticized. And there is no doubt in my mind that as Imre Finta is now off the hook, now I am on the hook before the Ontario Court of Appeal. What did I do? I read from the Bible about the trial of Christ to demonstrate that silence is not evidence of guilt, because my client didn't testify. We never called any evidence. I couldn't think of a better example to demonstrate that the presumption of innocence in our law is essential not to the preservation of guilty people, but to the preservation of innocent people. And I couldn't think of a more innocent person than Jesus Christ. And I couldn't think of a better demonstration. I couldn't think of a better demonstration of the principle that silence is not evidence of guilt. It can be evidence of innocence. And under Roman law, silence was evidence of guilt. You had to testify. But under British common law, you do not. The presumption of innocence is essential. And under British law, probably Jesus Christ could not have been convicted of anything. But he was under Roman law because he maintained silence to the charges. Nevertheless, those are the circumstances in which we live. And what do we do about these realities? I think that basically the position we have is the same as has always been the case throughout history. We either have to separate from those problems, in a sense, or surrender to them. We are in effect here now separated from a society that is hostile to these principles. We separate ourselves because we come together and talk to each other and with each other, and we don't just let others talk about us. So we have separated ourselves here today, but we will divide and go our separate ways and be individually attacked later for the principles we espouse. In effect, then, I suggest that we are contributing to the destruction of the principles that we claim to espouse by the way we live. We are living contrary to the principles we claim to espouse because we are supporting a system that is hostile to those principles in many, many ways. We will support that system through our taxes. We will support that system through our contributions to institutions such as nursing homes and schools and other institutions, even private institutions, which will basically support the destruction of the values that we hold. What do we need then to preserve our freedom? We need a government that respects that freedom. And since we cannot have that government in a federal sense, maybe cannot have that government in a provincial sense, we must find a city or a community that holds these values dear and is prepared to defend them within the law. There is no way, for example, that we can hold a meeting in Vancouver, Victoria, advertising in a public venue for people who want to hear David Irving. And we couldn't do that publicly for Ernst Zundel or Malcolm Ross. But if we had a place, a community where we had control of the infrastructure, we were elected to the council of this town, city, or municipality, and we had access to the public buildings, we could advertise that meeting far and wide. And that community could maintain the peace, the law, the security that allowed that meeting to publicly occur. If that is impossible in our society, then we have to escape from that part of our society where it's impossible and build a part of society where it is possible. This involves what most people are doing now, providing security for their old age, but building it in the real world rather than in a bank or in some institution or place that is not secure. Everyone must realize that banks are not secure. I think probably Tuesday morning, the bank where I have all my money, what little of it there is, the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank will probably be confronted with the situation where the Reichmans owe them a lot of money and they won't be getting it back. So what good has that done or will that do? But if we could invest in a community where peace, order, security, and freedom could exist, why would we not do so for the preservation throughout all of society of our values and the ability to communicate with all of society? Can we ensure that in a major city like Los Angeles, like Vancouver, like Toronto? Is Ernst Zundel secure at 206 Carlton Street? Perhaps as long as he stays indoors and does nothing, as the courts have maintained that he must do nothing and say nothing basically since 1986, he can survive. But can he live? Can anyone live in an atmosphere hostile to freedom of expression, freedom of speech? I say no, not really, not at all. Every community today has private property. We couldn't buy a hall of this size in any major city. We wouldn't have the money. But in smaller towns where buildings are cheaper, we could. And we could also, either through a number of vehicles, incorporate or establish privately the ownership of property in a community where we could control, in effect, the schools. We could control the instruments of our own freedom. We could become responsible for our own political self-determination. And there are many areas throughout British Columbia, throughout Western Canada, where this is possible. Why don't we do it? We need to maintain private property. We need to guarantee that every individual who would invest in such a community could extract their commitment if they felt uncomfortable about it. We need to guarantee that there is schools, industry, education, work. But there are many communities in which these things exist. Do they exist in Kelowna? I don't really think so. Do they exist in Penticton? I don't think so. If it was publicly announced that this meeting was to take place in Penticton prior to it occurring, it wouldn't be occurring. We wouldn't be free to stand here and speak about freedom of speech in Penticton. But if there was a community in which we who believe in freedom, we who believe in the need to search for truth, if we constituted the majority of citizens in that community, what would be the case? Well, we would determine the laws of that community. We could, in effect, establish the schooling, the industrial capability, and perhaps agricultural capability of that community. And our taxes wouldn't be going to schools that betray and destroy those principles. They would be going to a school or schools where our children could be educated in the maintenance and preservation of those principles. Which do you prefer? And what will you have if you do nothing about it? The municipality in any province, or state probably, has certain powers. They are limited powers, but they are considerable powers. As I'm sure that James Keekstra, who is the mayor of a community, knows, a municipality spends money. And it'll spend your money whether or not they spend it the way you want it to be spent. So why shouldn't we become, albeit we cannot through numbers directly influence any large institutional change, perhaps we should start on a smaller scale. Indeed, it's possible to establish and maintain the police force of small communities. This is not unnecessary and it is not unusual. There's volunteer fire departments, there could be volunteer police departments. There could be the protection and preservation of order and stability in the community through such institutions. What it really requires is a public-spirited populace. And I can understand why there is no common denominator, public spirit, in larger communities, because there is no common bonds. There are no common ideals. Naturally, anyone who is investing in some kind of community has to be guaranteed that their property will be maintained and preserved and respected. That, of course, is true today and could even be more true in a society where we became politically active. It's natural that this is not going to be possible where large numbers of people from other communities can infiltrate or can effectively control. There would have to be, in effect, access to water and power, hydroelectric facilities, or some other means of maintaining self-sufficiency. I don't think that self-sufficiency is essential, because it isn't for us essential where we live now. But in material matters, self-sufficiency is important. It isn't likely that anyone could be debt-free in a major city, but it is likely that everyone could be debt-free in a smaller community where the costs of living are considerably lower. There is certainly the potential to maintain our own publishing network. When one speaks of a hub, one speaks of a center from which distribution of information goes to other places. I'm not suggesting that this type of community would have to be maintained in isolation, but it's a center of security, peace, freedom, where communication can exist to other places so that other people in parts of the world can come to visit. Conferences like this could be held with peace and stability. and with security, and communication to other parts of the world could exist. But you can't do this in cities where you cannot lawfully assemble, although you're conducting a lawful activity. Cooperative effort is a really rewarding experience if it's done with the spirit of freedom and in a common goal. But can you feel that where you live? How many people feel that where you live? In the community where you live? How many people genuinely feel that they could share with the people around them and know that it's going to a cause they believe in? I see one hand. I guess he lives in a very small town. Right, Jim Green. But a community newspaper could become a larger newspaper as it was distributed further afield. It could be secure because the community guaranteed its security. But you couldn't have a newspaper that raised the issues that are raised here in Kelowna. You couldn't have one in almost any town I know of. But a community newspaper could become a larger newspaper. It could become a publishing institution for books. It could grow. It could grow naturally, organically, with the support of people around the world that see the value of this community. And people who didn't live in that community could provide for their old age or time of retirement, or when they wish to come to that community, they could make donations to the community. They could make a gradual commitment to that community. They could buy property, or they could simply arrange to be able to buy property at a later time when it was convenient to them. These are potentials for the establishment of an environment that is not hostile to freedom and to truth. Community halls, recreational facilities, and schools can grow, and they can become universities, and the community can grow. And as it becomes evident, if you have communicated the truth, you will indeed find that people around the world value that, and they want to come and talk to you, and they want to live close to you, and they want to feel comfortable nearby you. And you will find that those who share those values are very supportive of you, and you will not feel isolated and insecure in a hostile environment. How would the community make money? It could be, in effect, a refuge for other people of similar mind and like values around the world. A refuge to visit, a refuge for recreational purposes. It could be in an environment that was so pleasant. It could start out, actually, as a hotel. You could buy a hotel. You could buy some buildings in a town which is a recreational town, a smaller one, and gradually accumulate either corporately, individually, collectively, in other ways, the means so that people could come there and spend a couple of weeks enjoying their summer holidays with some people who are talking about more than beer and sports. Some people who are interested in important issues. That's potentially possible. A university originated with the idea of scholars and thinkers and philosophers coming to a place to talk to each other. It didn't originate, much to the surprise of many people, with a government grant. But this institution of our educational system to preserve values of freedom and pursuit of truth will not survive in the atmosphere in which society is heading today. And we must guarantee survival of the pursuit of truth. We, of course, each have talents. We're all endowed with certain abilities. Everyone in this room has done something to support themselves. And those talents and abilities could be put to use in a community where we live together rather than apart. Often, of course, we're going to have individual differences. Of course, there are those in every society, but there must be, and there are probably, common bonds that are greater than our individual differences. That's what society really was about, and is about, in the truest sense. Each of us, with whatever skills we have, of education, of delivering mail, of building roads, of building buildings, of medical work, or any of the skills we have, could put those skills together in our own community. There is the community, for example, in British Columbia, which probably has $20 million worth of infrastructure and about 300 people. It's a community that will soon be abandoned because the mine is closed. It's called Cassiar. Now, nobody wants to live in Cassiar today, but it might be a very popular place if the world becomes unpleasant tomorrow. I'm not suggesting that's the answer. There must be, and there is, a place that is far better than being surrounded by a hostile environment outside of our ideals. But that's an example of what leverage buyouts have accomplished. I learned something from the Bellsbergs, you know. One of their activities has been to buy companies whose share value was far lower than their capital assets distributed. Think about that. Their share value usually is a reflection of their dividend value or of the speculation in the market, but companies that have a whole lot of assets but very little income are worth a lot of money, but not as companies, as wound-up institutions where you sell the assets and pay out the shareholders a dividend of those assets. You, in effect, take the company and sell it and divide the profits. There are many towns that are very similar. There are towns that are becoming abandoned because everybody's moving to the city for prosperity, and those towns have enormous infrastructure. They have, of course, roads, they have schools, they have churches, they have buildings, public buildings, large public buildings. Nobody's using them. Why? Because there's nobody there to use them. And that town, in effect, maybe a couple of hundred people, also has other facilities that are not being used. There's nobody there. Any group of people, very small number of people who came to acquire the property in that town would command the council of that town, would in effect control the assets of that town for virtually a small investment. But you couldn't have that leverage in a large center. Do you really want to live in Los Angeles? Now there's potential for manufacturing, of course, but these would have to be developed and explored with a great deal of discussion, which obviously isn't going to be possible today. I see it's 11:30. I didn't want to go on about this, but I think the basic principle is that freedom of association, freedom of expression, and the pursuit of truth, those basic principles provide us with the solution to the problems that are faced by those who wish to speak out in a very much more important way than we have been allowed to in this rapidly tyrannizing society, rapidly deteriorating economic and intellectual environment in which we are now living. I think these are ideas that should be explored for the preservation of the freedom we need to pursue the truth, to speak it, and to live it in a peaceful and orderly and secure society and environment. These are ideas that I offer for discussion. There are many more aspects to this, of course, that could be discussed. Time is of the essence. I don't think we have very much more time. I don't want to bore you with it, but I want to answer any questions that you might have about these issues. I want to thank you for your attention.
We will now entertain questions, please. Yes, Jim.
For 15 years, my wife and I searched for a place that we might go to. We're living in Alberta. You see Rocky Mountain House would be the place. We find that the North Shore of the Shuswap is probably what we'd like to be involved in. We are taking part in the community. We have our citizens group now, 60 of us. We're in line for what exactly you were talking about. But if somebody else said, let's go to Cassiar, we sure pick up and go from as the movement starts.
Well, that's a great spirit. Hey, any other questions?
Is there such a community that you have in mind?
No, like we all have certain ideas. I don't have any particular community in mind. I just think it's an idea that should be explored. That brings me to one thought, and that is that every idea needs a name, a catch name. And maybe it should be called the Newgate Project, because it's a new gate, meaning a new door into a new way of living that we should be prepared to investigate. And it's something that I think we should. you know, if there's a serious interest in this, we should establish further discussions about it. We should explore the options that there are, and persons should look in and report back on various communities to find out which is the best alternative, and then decisions should be made. But I have no community in mind. No specific place. Sounds pretty good at Solista, I think. It's amazing that anybody has 60 people working together in a community these days, and quite an accomplishment. Yeah.
Cassio mentioned, is there anybody here, or would there be any, how shall I put it, you know, for a new industry, something that would sustain the town and make it thrive, because I'm sure that it is, property could be purchased quite cheap.
Yeah. Well, of course, when people think about sustaining a community, they always think about industry, and that's quite a logical thing to do. But in this day and age, security itself is an industry. People are looking for security. And I don't just mean, and social security is not security. I mean a community in which they could be looked after in terms of their old age. I know many, many people who are now going to save money for a nursing home, and it's going to be in downtown Victoria or Vancouver, and they're going to be treated by people who totally disagree with everything they believe in till they die. If they live a lot longer and a lot happier if they were being cared for by people in a community where they and their values were admired, were respected, were loved. And that's what I'm talking about. Also, publishing is part of it, that it's potential. But every different area would have different economic potential in terms of an industry, of agriculture, and even of tourism, because that shouldn't be discounted. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that money can come to a place that's doing good work. Yeah.
Would there be any income?
Well, that's a good question. There's always going to be a government in somewhere else that can tax you if you have income. But donation of services to a village, to a town, can result in that town having the facilities to provide you with other services that you wouldn't otherwise have, contributing to a quality of life. Why do you want money? You want money to have a quality of life. Did you know there are counselors who were sent to the best hotel in Winnipeg to discuss being counselors. All it was just a big drunk in Winnipeg, right? Now, there's nothing to prevent a community from having so much surplus income that they could send citizens on a holiday with public funds. Why shouldn't they? If you contributed and you worked on building the roads or working in the schools and doing the things that have to be done for the community, you might have no income. But the community might very well be justified in rewarding you and other citizens who serve similarly with a lot of good quality life. And if you get the good quality life without the income, they really can't tax it. And the federal government has yet to tax villages and municipalities on their income. They don't pay income tax. These are just thoughts. I suppose you might say that... Sorry, go ahead. I don't think I want to expand on that answer, so I'll wait for your question.
My name's Ed Moyer. I'm 29 years old. I feel really ripped off. I've been taught stuff in school, and I'm learning differently now.
Yeah.
The idea that you talk about building community, adopting thought of it makes good sense.
Yeah.
I think if everybody uses common sense and sticks together, there's no reason why this can't happen. I have a moving company. I work in television. I see old people moved into old folks' homes and taken away from their family to
basically to die.
To die.
Yeah.
Why can't we build a place where I know farmers can have a barn and a kitchen for women, a barn, you know, this type stuff, where people can work together still and keep themselves alive and support a system, just like maybe a Harvard colony. For instance.
Well, you know, what you're saying is man is a spiritual being, man and woman. Man in the gender is not necessarily what I mean, but I mean man generically is a spiritual being. We're lacking a spiritual community where intellectual, moral, spiritual values can be expressed. And there are so many wonderful things like you're discussing that could be done, but we don't have a place where we could build them, things to do them with. I hope that out of this might come a plan of action where we would do that. Yeah, right. We'd be great to work together. There's nothing better than a community that really is a community, wants to be a community, and loves the members of that community in the true spiritual sense of that word. I remember one time in the little village of Cochrane, Alberta, where my family lives. The cemetery was all run down. The tombstones were all falling over. The gophers were digging up the graves. And my dad was a counselor for a very short time. And he, for one time, got everybody in the whole community working together to fix up the cemetery. And people donated trucks. People donated backhoes. People made the meals. People worked out there with shovels and rakes and made suppers and lunches for the people working there. It was a terrific feeling. And in 3 days, they totally improved that cemetery. And the next thing was, what can we do now? And the answer was, nothing. And the community went back to sleep. And then basically back to bickering and hating their neighbors and all the things that communities have done for so long. You know, idle hands, right? Well, our community at large is full of idle hands. Recreation is not the most important thing. The greatest recreation is to do something good. Yeah.
But also build up schools where parents, like-minded parents, could send their children to college or education.
Right. Well, that's right. You know, we have some pretty good teachers, but they aren't going to be able to teach because they might be telling the truth that the political leaders didn't want to hear. They could teach in our school. You know, there still is some authority for private schools. There's still some authority for local community schools. And these schools could be schools where people that couldn't teach elsewhere could teach. And, you know, that would be very interesting. Students could begin to learn, to think, to look for the truth. I mean, the reason why there's so many dropouts out of schools that are now in existence is because truth is an enemy of those schools. It's the indoctrination, the rote memory, and people are getting sick of that. Students are naturally sick of that. They want to seek the truth and meaning in life. But as you have more and more of these secular humanistic trends, the pursuit of truth becomes dangerous for a teacher. And taking political stands is impossible. Religious expression. I represented a man called Zinger once from a little town called Stettler, Alberta. And he was fired as a teacher, and his sin was to, you know, these days when teachers don't do anything, I think there are 3 out of 4 days like that. Yeah, whatever they are. He was asked to bring his guitar, and they said, sing us some songs. And he said, well, all I can sing now that I've been saved is hymns. And so he sang a couple of hymns, and he was fired for that, because he was proselytizing, expressing his religion. And you know, Christianity can be viewed as an intolerant religion, because it says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. So there's only one God, only one Jesus Christ. Some Christians honestly believe that there's no salvation outside of Jesus Christ. I happen to be one of them. But assuming that to be a belief, then how can you teach that all religions are good? And that's the theology of modern education, that all religions are good. That there is no truth, everything's true. And eventually, nothing's true. Well, if nothing's true, why do you have to learn anything, right? That's what every kid's going to say in the end. That's what they're saying now. If we don't have the means to teach that there is a truth, that you must find the truth, and the truth will set you free. If we don't have those basic principles in our education system, our children will die in despair. And I don't want to see that, you don't want to see that, and therefore we have to build an education system for our offspring. Yeah.
What protection have we against terrorism? Do that live in isolation, or?
No, you say what protection we have against terrorism? Well, there is no real threat of physical violence. There's usually just intimidation, like there was for this meeting. There's demonstrations, that kind of thing. Well, a community where the law is maintained fairly and impartially is no threat to us. There's no threat to freedom, no threat to truth. You know, there's nothing wrong with that aspect of freedom which gives everyone the right to demonstrate. But there is something wrong with any freedom that gives people the power to intimidate others from lawful assembly by demonstration. And there is something wrong with bomb threats. But if the law says we don't go after the bomb threatener, we go after the victim of the bomb threat, there's something wrong with the administration of the law. And if we are, you know, the law is basically potentially good and neutral. All we need is the impartial administration of law and fairness. So what we're talking about is people who will administer the law fairly for all, not just for the powerful, for the presently rich, but for us as well. How much time we got?
We can take 2 or 3.
Okay, 2 more questions, and yours and Paul's.
This man was fired in hymns.
Yeah.
Are you aware that a Muslim priest was had from the United States congressional meeting one time in their prayer, and the Christian minister that the chapel was looking after, he just kind of pressured and kind of overruled in the law in Catholic.
Well, if the United States is a secular society, then of course it's natural that Mohammedans or Muslims, as well as Jews and Buddhists, must all have equal rights. And that's the position of the United States, I guess. It's not, you know, it's not a Christian country, and they say that about Canada. Well, that's fine. What can we do about Canada? Very little, really. We could have a Christian community, or a community that believed that Christianity was the way, the truth, and the life. It doesn't have to have everybody dictated to. It just means that if those who want to share those beliefs decide to join in the establishment of a community, they should be free, and they will be free to do so. The only thing is, they haven't done so. I can't do anything about the Congress of the United States, I can't do anything about the Parliament of Canada, and there's very little I can do about the government of Victoria. But maybe, out of this meeting, we could start to do something about building a community where we would feel comfortable and could hold peacefully assembled meetings. I don't want to get off that topic, really. We can analyze the problem forever. We must become the solution. Okay. Thank you. Okay.